Everybody, welcome. Thank you for joining ABC and Employer Solutions Law for a discussion around the Washington CARES Act. I'll introduce Karen Forner and let her take it away.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the webinar on the Washington CARES Act. I hope that you will find this information helpful. It's an interesting law, and it kind of reared its ugly head a couple years ago and then went dormant, but it is back and alive and kicking. So I'm glad you're here to learn about what you need to do and what's coming and maybe some of the challenges you might face. And I want to thank ABC of Western Washington for asking me to present. I really enjoy my partnership with that organization. A little bit about myself, if you don't know who I am. I'm a local native Washingtonian, born and raised in the state. I went to Whitman College and UW Law, so got my education in the state as well. I worked for the Attorney General's office for 14 years, representing labor and industries. So I've got a lot of experience dealing with Washington state government, kind of understand the mind of the beast, so to speak, and how it operates. And since I left the Attorney General's office, I've been representing employers on all kinds of labor and industries issues and employment law issues, and answering questions around various laws like the Washington CARES Act. And I'm doing more and more training as I advance in age in my career, and I really enjoy helping employers avoid expensive problems in the first place, which is partly why I'm doing this training today. So the Washington CARES Act, what is it all about? You know, the purpose of the act is to provide long-term care insurance for workers in Washington state. So, you know, there's Social Security, which is the federal system. We passed the Washington Family Medical Leave Act, which is a shorter term paid leave if you have a baby or there's an illness in the family. Long-term care is a different and new act. Typically, people only got long-term care if it was somehow provided as a benefit by their employer, or they bought it on the secondary market. And just a lot of people didn't do that and ended up needing care at home and didn't have funds to pay for it. And so Washington state, the legislature decided we are basically going to mandate that everyone pay into long-term care insurance. A little bit of the history I was alluding to earlier. The law was passed back in 2019, and it was supposed to get going, I think in 2021. When people saw what the law was, there was lawsuits around it, whether it was legal or not. And a lot of people were kicking and screaming when they saw what the law was going to be and said it should be modified. So they basically put it on hold and delayed the implementation of it until they could make a few more tweaks and have a few more exemptions. And now we're in 2023, and they've done the tweaking and said, this is what it's going to be. Everyone's going to pay in starting July 1st of 2023, and there's a few exemptions. So it kind of was a big deal, 2019 or 20, died down. We had the pandemic. Everyone was focused on dealing with COVID and kind of forgot about it. And now it's back again. So how does this program work? Every employee in Washington state, unless you opted out or have an exemption that is that you apply for and that Employment Security gives you an exemption form, every employee in the state is going to have 0.58% of their earnings, or that's 58 cents on the for every $100, it's 0.58 that you pay. So it's not a huge amount, but it's significant when you look at yearly earnings, which we'll get to later. If you are self-employed, you don't have to pay into the program, although you can opt to pay to participate in the program. And everyone's going to be paying into the system starting with payroll July 1st of this year forward. And it will be in 2026, July of 2026, that eligible people can start applying for and getting those benefits. Now, if you were born before January 1st, 1968, you might be retiring. You might be getting ready to retire. And oftentimes you have to put in for a full 10 years before you can get your full benefits. So they did, when they modified the law, they said, well, if you're only working 2 or 3 more years and then you're going to retire, we'll give you modified benefits because you didn't pay into the system as long. You don't get the full amount, but you can get some money out. That was a lot of people who were older were screaming about the act before. Why should I pay in for 5, 6, 7 years at the end of my career when I'm making the most money and putting a lot of money into it and I'm not eligible? Because before you couldn't get any money unless you had paid in for 10 years. So that's one of the benefit changes that was made as the legislature took another look at the law before rolling it out. So back when the law was first passed, there was kind of a one-time shot for your regular employees to opt out of the program. And that meant that you had to go out, shop on the secondary market, and get your own long-term care insurance. Then provide that to the state and get an exemption form. So there was a mad scramble in the state for people who knew about it. Many people did not feel this was a good option for them or a good use of their money. So they ran out and got their own long-term care insurance. However, that's not available anymore. So for people who did it, those exemptions still apply. They probably turned it in back in 2021 and filed that, but the deadline for that is passed. So there's no way to get out of the program saying, hey, I'll go get my own long-term care insurance. The window to do that has already passed. However, if any employee has already provided it to their employer or in the coming months says, hey, I got my exemption from employment security for getting long-term care insurance, here's my exemption, those people have opted out and they can't opt back in again. It's kind of a permanent opting out if you did that. So what's that leave now? Well, everyone's got to pay unless they fall in a few exemption categories. If you are working for the federal government and live in Washington, you're exempt from contributing. Employees of tribal businesses, the tribes, unless they choose to opt in, are not participants in the program. And again, self-employed doesn't have to pay in, although you can decide that you do want to participate and opt in. And the other people who are exempt, the people who got the private insurance before November 1st, 2021, that's no longer an option, but that exemption still works. And they can log into employment security and download that exemption letter if they've misplaced it or the employer doesn't still have it or they've moved to a new employer. For veterans, if they can apply for an exemption if they have 70% or more service-related disability, they can choose to exempt out. Or spouses of active military members can opt out. Of course, if they are no longer married to or their spouse at a later point is not in the military, then they lose that exemption. So you kind of have to, for the active duty military spouses, that only lasts as long as your spouse meets that exemption. If you've got a non-migrant visa for temporary work, those people don't have to pay in. Again, if they do become a permanent resident or citizen, then they'd be required to pay in. And people who have a primary residence out of the state of Washington, who happen to be working in Washington, maybe on a temporary basis or a traveling basis, they don't have to pay in. But if they do end up moving to Washington and get a permanent residence here, then they would have to start paying into it. part of the reason for that is the benefit only applies to people who are living in Washington and need the benefit. So if someone is living in California but happens to be working up in Washington, the argument would be, why am I paying into a system that I can never benefit from down the line? So you as an employer, you might have your own feelings about this act, or you know that your employees are not going to want to pay into it. You cannot apply for them. You can't just say they need this. Each employee has to go to the Employment Security website and apply for an exemption. And the Washington Cares Fund website is pretty well organized and pretty clear. There's resources for employers, how to apply for an exemption. You can just Google search Washington Cares and that website will come up. So if you have employees who you think will want an exemption and apply for it before July 1st rolls around, you'll probably want to be pushing out information about this to your employees so they can get their exemption before the payroll deductions start. And you can't do it on your employees' behalf. And again, if you're approved for an exemption, that's going to be for those who got the long-term care insurance, that's permanent. You can't just change your mind later and opt back in. And for the other exemptions, those will remain in place until their circumstances change. So if, again, if you're out of state and you get an exemption, that doesn't change unless you get your state residence. This is just a little bit of a summary again. Living outside of Washington, spouse of a service member, have non-immigrant work visas, or you have veterans status, 70% or higher disability. That's pretty much the remaining exemptions. If you're a tribal company or self-employed, you can opt in, but as far as getting exempted out, these are really the only options left for people. But that seems kind of like what I just said, or maybe I didn't advance my slide. So before there was the deadline for getting the long-term care insurance, there's no deadline for the existing exemptions. So it's just kind of a rolling program. If you fit any of these categories, you can go ahead, apply for it, and get your exemption. And then you have an obligation to report to your employer or Employment Security if your status changes and that exemption no longer applies to you. And of course, there's going to be penalties. So if you got an exemption saying I live in Idaho and you move to Washington and continue to work in Washington, but you don't notify your employer and Employment Security that that exemption no longer applies, you're going to get dinged with penalties. You're responsible for that 0.58% of the money you made, plus there's going to be a penalty on top of it because the government wants to have a stick to force people to follow the rules of the program. There is a mailing list that's on that Washington Cares Fund site to get updates of what's going on. And since this is rolling out and there's going to be a lot of action on this or at least the date of this revised law, I encourage you to have your HR people sign up to get on the email list. If you're on our law firm newsletter list, we're going to be trying to push out information as well, but getting it in real time quickly right from the Employment Security Washington Cares Fund site is probably a good idea. So if someone's exemption is approved, again, you have to get that exemption approval letter from Employment Security, give it to your current employer, and keep a copy of it, because you'll need to give it to each subsequent employer you work at if you don't want them taking that money out of your paycheck. So the employer will keep taking premiums out of your paycheck until the exemption letter is given. And then in the next quarter of reporting is when they'll stop doing it. So your exemption is opting out kind of quarter by quarter by quarter. So if you have employees who qualify for an exemption and July 1st is the date, they want to get that exemption letter from Employment Security to their employer before July 1st. If they wait, they're likely subject to getting the withholding that whole quarter and that third quarter of 2023, and they won't really get the exemption and not have the money taken out until fourth quarter. So it's a little bit urgent if someone qualifies for an exemption to get that to their employer and get that date done before July 1st. So what are employers supposed to do? If they get a copy of an exemption letter, it's required to be kept on file, and don't take the money out of that worker's paycheck. And you do that in the quarter after the effective date on the letter that they present to you from Employment Security. So again, there's employer toolkits, additional information on the Washington Cares Fund website. I encourage you to go there. I'll be highlighting a few of the resources here. This presentation is mostly a heads up of what's coming, some of the basics, and if you want to get down into more of the weeds, this website is a great place to start. And if it's somehow complicated, of course, feel free to call our office. I think there's a lot of good information there. When the law was first passed, they said, well, people that are part of collective bargaining agreements are not subject to this act until that agreement is reopened for being renegotiated or it expires. Well, since the law was passed quite a while ago and there was this big delay, I would suggest that really most union employers or employees are still going to be covered by this, because most union agreements have reopened since October 19th of 2017. So if you happen to be a union employer and are dealing with union employees under a collective bargaining agreement, see if that agreement was reopened anytime since October 19th of 2017. And if so, those employees have to have the money taken out of their paycheck as well. One thing that is going to be a shock to many of your workers, and perhaps a surprise to you, is unlike the Washington Paid Family Leave Act, the new leave law that was passed a couple years ago that taps out the money you take out to pay for it at the maximum of Social Security. For this law, there is no cap. You are taking out 0.58% of all wages and remuneration. So it's salary, tip income, overtime, stock options, bonus pay, commission pay, whatever that huge lump of gross compensation is, 0.58% of that has to get sent into the state. So these are a couple examples. So someone makes $65,000 a year. They're going to get taxed about $377 a year, which is maybe more than some people want to pay, but there it is. But the more money people make, the more highly compensated they are, the higher it's going to be. You can see someone who makes $150,000 a year, which frankly in the Puget Sound area is not a crazy salary for management and professional people. They're paying $870 a year. And then I'm not excellent at math, but if someone makes $300,000 a year, now they're paying, they're making $300,000, $1,600, $1,700 a year. So for your more highly compensated employees, there might be sticker shock on how much money is coming out of their paychecks. If you've got someone on an annual wage, you know, I try to do easy math on this one. They make $120,000 a year, $10,000 a month. You take out 0.58% of that $10,000 a month. And then if they get a bonus at the end of the year in December, they're paid $15,000. Then you take 0.58% out of that $15,000, and then that's paid in that quarterly reporting as well. So the money starts getting taken out of paychecks on July 1st of this year. And the first report is due to employment security on October 31st. So they're going on the same system and timing as the Paid Family and Medical Leave Act. So there'll be kind of two lumps, like here's the money for Paid Family and Medical Leave Act, although there's a cap on how much money a person earns for that percentage to get put in. And then at the same time, you'll say, and here's Paid Family and Medical Leave, and there's no cap. So it's whatever that person earns. So there's going to be two reporting. They will try to do it at the same time. I think they're making an attempt to make it more streamlined. There you go. And if you have an employee who has a status change, employee again has to notify the employer and employment security of any change within 90 days. So that's what the law is. That's the money that's going to start coming out of paychecks. That's going to be the reporting mechanism. You know, what for people who are paying into it, you're going to be asked by employees, well, what do we get for this? Well, some people can get early access if they've contributed 3 out of the last 6 years. They can earn the benefit. In general, people have to contribute 10 years without a break in 5 consecutive years to get that full benefit, which is a lifetime benefit of $36,500. Again, if you've got people who are really close to retirement and are not going to get that 10 years in and 5 years without a break at all, if they're older, born before 1968, which I fit in that group, they get 10% for each year they contribute. So $33,650 for each full year you're contributing up until when you might need benefits. So it's a reduced benefit program for people who are a little closer to retirement. So one problem that they haven't fixed yet is a lot of people say, yes, I'm going to work really hard in Washington, and I want to retire in Arizona where it's sunnier, or Mexico, or somewhere else. Right now, you have to pay in this program if you are a Washington resident and you don't meet any exemption, but you only get the benefit if you continue living in and having a residence in Washington. So you could pay in for 20 years, 15 years at a very high rate if you're more highly compensated, and never be able to avail yourself of the benefits. That's how the law stands right now. If you do continue to live in Washington and you apply for benefits, you have to live in Washington and need assistance or supervision with 3 activities of daily living. So eating, toileting, bathing, body care, mobility, memory care, cognitive functioning, these types of things that long-term care insurance tends to provide. So this law is meant that people don't have to reduce their income and assets so low that Medicare or Medicaid would kick in and provide these. It allows people to keep their assets or their home or some of their savings and still get this money to pay for help with some of these things. And I'm trying to get my slide to advance. There we go. And the payment can go to family members. There's going to be protocol about who can get paid. There can be training and support for paid and unpaid family members who provide care, adaptive equipment, memory care, transportation, things of this nature. So a challenge for, there's kind of 2 challenges for employers. What's the law? When's it starting? How do I deal with exemptions? How do I do the math on the right amount of money to take out of paychecks and report that back to employment security? I think another challenge is going to be communicating with employees. So I think a lot are going to be mad. Paychecks will be smaller than they were before, and they will say, I don't want to participate in that. and you as an employer saying, I didn't make this law. This is what the government is telling us we have to do. You know, here's the exemptions. If you give us this form, if you qualify, if not, we've got to take the money out. There are some forms on the Washington Cares Fund website that you can give to employees, either email out to them, include with their paycheck. Of course, it's selling what a wonderful program it is and all the benefits and how it works, but there are resources there. You can, I think it's better to communicate with employees that it's coming, in general, what the law is about. I think that it is truthful that about 7 out of 10 of us need some kind of long-term care. In our state, the answer from our legislature was, well, the government should do that. Some employees will say, well, people should have saved up their own money to do that, or that's what family is for. And those arguments will come. You'll just say that, you know, your answer is this state decided to pass a law for the government to fill that role, to make sure everyone has funds for this kind of long-term care. So this is one example. It's a one-page sheet that's on the website. How the fund works, contributions, eligibility, and benefits, trying to sell that it is a good idea and a good program. So that is what's coming. The law's been around for a few years. It just kind of was put on hold for a while, and now it's up and going. And I hope today I've given you an idea of, again, most employees in the state are going to be covered and have to pay in. The remaining exemptions are limited, and the option to opt out with getting your own long-term care insurance, that ship has already sailed. Anyone who got in under the wire on that, their exemption still counts, but that's not an option for anyone going forward. I think employees are going to be surprised, and I think having a proactive communication strategy with your employees is a good idea, and people don't like surprises. So some will think it's a good idea, some will think it's a horrible idea, but communicating ahead of time of what's coming is prudent. And for you as an employer, the Washington Cares website, whoever is already processing payroll and deductions for Washington paid family and medical leave, that person is familiar with that concept. This is just adding another program on top of that. And remembering, family leave is capped out. I think it's around that $120,000 mark, but I'm not positive. But the maximum for Social Security earnings, and this program has no cap, and it includes commissions, bonuses, stock options, everything counts. And with that, I will put up here this slide. Again, my phone number is there. That's my email. If you get stuck down the line or have questions, you're welcome to reach out to our firm. One of the attorneys who focuses on employment law will be able to help you. For that, I will stop sharing and see that there's a number of people on the call, and I think we have plenty of time for question and answers if anyone. And some questions you'll have, I won't have the answer yet because the program's not going, but I'll take your questions whether I can answer them or not, because I'll find an answer if there is a way.
Karen, there's a couple questions in the chat.
I'll have you read those. I don't dare click on that and then lose my screen.
Stock options. I thought it was only W-2 reported wages.
My understanding is that it includes stock options from the materials I read on the ESD website. So since I haven't actually walked my clients through that yet, I would say I can't tell you 100% that I'm positive about that. As we're talking, I would go and look at the website again. And then my question is, how do you evaluate that? And how do you take money out from that? That seems like a giant mess. So thank you, whoever did that, for pointing out the one question I don't feel super confident about answering with specificity. but I wouldn't presume that that's not covered. So that's one, double check on that or check back with me later. I'm a curious person. I love to know answers. So I will be following up on that, even if I contact Employment Security themselves and get more guidance on that. So if you want to send me an email, I'll email you back what I find out on that, whoever was the person who had that question. Someone said, I think stock options are reportable wages once they're exercised. So it's, when and how and valuation on stock options. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that right now. That's a very good question. I did see a question pop up of what if we start taking money out of their paycheck on July 1st and we get an exemption letter, later. From what I read from the website is the employer is not obligated to give the money back to the worker. They can just stop taking it out from the quarter after the eligibility date. But I think this is a question. Someone gets something from Employment Security that says you are exempt as of June 25th. So they got in before the third quarter, but they don't actually give the exemption letter to their employer for another 30 days. Meanwhile, they've already had money taken out of their first paycheck. My understanding from reading the department website is that they don't get reimbursement for the money already taken out. But then you would stop doing it because their exemption was prior to that quarter. Yeah. Anything else in chat, Janessa?
There is. Eric, who had asked the question about stock options, said K1 earnings is another common one, question mark.
Great question. I don't know, Eric, but I will find out and email you back.
I'll make sure that Karen has your contact information, Eric.
Oh, I know, Eric.
Okay, good.
Thanks, Karen.
Yeah, I think it is a good question. There's what is self-employed and what if you've got, 5 members of an LLC or an S Corp or things like that. Where does that compensation fit in? I'm not positive, but those tend to be the more highly compensated people, the people who are looking at 1,700, 2,000, 2,500, 3,000 a year, depending on how well the business is doing. It'll be a giant chunk out of their earnings paying into the program if they have to report. I think if you're a business owner, you don't have to. And the reason I remember this is I owned my law firm right around when this was coming about. But I was selling my law firm to Brian Paget, who now actually owns the firm, knowing I would become an employee working back from the firm. And I didn't want my earnings taxed. So I got my own private long-term care insurance, got the exemption, frankly, canceled my insurance shortly thereafter because it was super expensive. And I'm just self-insured for taking care of myself when I'm old and need help. So that's how I handled that. So I think, Eric, that probably K1s or just earnings, if you are a business owner, are not taxed, but I'm not positive on that. Let me look into that and I'll get back to you.
Sounds good. I think you're right. I think it's W-2 wages, which if stock options are realized on your W-2, then that makes sense. But I don't think K1 but I don't know. It'd be great to get that confirmed.
Yep. I'm doing this training for a number of organizations in the next month because it's coming. So that's good. I'm going to try to get for the next, this is the first webinar I've done. So it'll be really good that I can look up some of these other nuanced questions. Oh my gosh, what is that? Okay, some of these other nuanced questions to hopefully be able to answer them better in real time next time around. I'm learning all this as well. Any other questions or anything in chat, Janessa?
Yeah, Doug asked if there will be an audit of previously approved exemptions.
I don't know what you mean by an audit. I haven't heard anything about that. I know that employers have to keep them on file if they were turned in. I do know that anyone who got one had a employment security account. You can log in and re-download your letter if need be. Is the question, are you, I mean, I think you're subject to government audit on anything you do, from L&I on your workers' comp premiums, from employment security on how you're reporting earnings or whatnot. I'm sure there's a methodology where they're going to audit. Have you processed exemptions properly? Are you paying in for everybody? My guess is people, especially if there's any suggestion they're not doing it right, could be subject to an audit. Anything else in there, Janessa?
Let's see. Denise noted that she has employees that purchased LTC insurance prior to November 2021, but she doesn't have exemption letters. I'm thinking she needs to go tell them to get them.
If they don't have an exemption letter from employment security, I think they're out of luck, because you had to get your long-term care insurance before that November 2021 and get your exemption letter from employment security by a deadline that was 2021 or 2022. So if they don't have the exemption letter, it doesn't matter if they got their own long-term care insurance. I think they're out of luck. They need that magic letter. And just like the other exemptions now, it doesn't matter if you're married to a military spouse. It doesn't matter if you have your disability. It doesn't matter if you have a residence out of state. That money comes out of your paycheck unless that employee goes to the website, applies for an exemption, and gets the magic letter blessing that exemption. It won't count. They can't just come tell you, oh, I live in Idaho, don't take that money out of my paycheck. Nope. So you do want to be communicating with your employees. The money's coming out of your paycheck unless you fit an exemption and you deliver to us the magic letter that employment security buys off on your exemption. Then for that next quarter, we don't take money out. And if you don't want us to start taking it out on July 1st, get us the exemption letter from employment security before, June 25th, or in time for us when we're doing our payroll, whenever your payroll is. So let employees know of the deadline. They've got to get the exemption letter. So you have to have the qualifying circumstance and the letter if you don't want the money coming out of your paycheck.
On that same note, what about new hires?
Anyone coming in new, we're going to take the money out of your paycheck. Although if you already have an exemption letter and hand it to us in your new, so part of your new hire checklist should be, do you have an exemption letter for Washington CARES Act? Because as we set up your payroll to pay you, we're going to be taking out 0.58% of your paycheck unless you come with us with a valid ESD letter, and it's their obligation to get it. If they don't have one, you got to start taking it out until they get one, give you one.
Do you think it would be possible for someone maybe like moving from another state into Washington state who has their own private long-term care insurance?
The private long-term care thing, that ship has sailed. It's the few, the proud that got on it back in 2021. And it wasn't easy. One, a lot of people didn't know about it. And two, private long-term care companies were getting swamped with thousands of requests because people wanted to get it. And so a lot of companies just fled the state. Some big places, my understanding is places like Microsoft and things like that got big companies to come in and kind of automatically give it to a lot of their employees. Like, just sign up here. Any Microsoft employee can get long-term care insurance, get their opt-out letters, and like, we're done. Because there's a lot of super highly compensated people at Microsoft making $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 a year who weren't keen on paying $4,000 or $5,000 a year for a benefit that's $36,000 total over their lifetime. They'd end up paying in 5 times what they could ever get out of it. But that's how the program works. They want people who make more money to be supplementing people who don't make very much money to pay for long-term care. So they didn't really want, they don't want a lot of people opting out of the program. So that ship has sailed, Janessa. So if someone comes in from out of state to work here, unless they're 70% disabled or married to a military spouse or are working on tribal lands, that they're going to have to pay.
And what kind of notice was given?
Pardon me?
Back in 2021, when folks were clamoring to get this private insurance, how were they supposed to know that they needed to get an exemption?
They didn't want people to get exemptions. So the
Right.
government was like, it was like word of mouth. Word of mouth. People like, oh, holy crap, did you know? And then everyone was kind of scrambling because the government didn't want to promote, here's a way out of this program, because they knew it would be higher compensated people who save their money and have tight families. It's like, why would I pay into this? I know I'm not going to need this, and I don't want all that money coming. They didn't want those people out of the program. So they did not push this information out because they did. I mean, I'm just going to be honest. I don't think they wanted people to opt out. And now that ship has sailed. So please do not shoot the messenger. I am not the governor. I am not the legislature. I have my own feelings about politics in Washington that you can take me out for lunch and I'd be happy to chit chat with you about. I'm telling you the rationale of the state and the policy arguments of why it's here and that it's here. And I think for employers, it shouldn't be that unfamiliar how you do it because you've been doing it under the Washington Paid Leave Act. But the fact that there's no cap on earnings for that 0.58% is going to be a shock to some. And there you go.
Well, I'm very happy that the 24 folks who registered for this webinar and anybody who follows up by watching this on our on-demand page through ABC gets this information now. It is too late, and I fear that the consequences could be pretty harsh if we don't start to play ball.
Well, you have to follow this law, right? It's just, you pay your workers' comp premiums, whether you like L&I or not. You pay the Washington Family and Medical Leave Act premiums because it's the law. And you're going to have to take the money out and pay into Washington Cares Fund because it's the law. So knowing how to do that, if you're already doing Washington paid family and medical leave, it's on the same schedule. It's going to look really similar. Probably the big difference is you don't have that cap. I don't think anyone can opt out of the Washington family leave. This program has a few exemptions. Those who got that private insurance and opt-out letter a couple years ago, they still get to stay out of it. And anyone else who gets an exemption letter for those kind of floating, rolling exemptions that you can go in and out of depending if you qualify or not. But everyone else is going to pay in. I think it's W-2 employees. I do believe stocks are. I don't know the details on when that's valuated and when you take the money out and when they're exercised. I've never been lucky enough to have stock options, so I'm not super familiar with that, but I'll look into it. I don't think K1 S Corp distributions to owners, I don't believe that is covered, but Eric, I will look into that and get back to you. And that's about all I've got. If anyone else has any other questions, I see, is that a hand raised or it's my own hand? Okay. Kind of last call for a question, comment, concern. You don't have to put it in chat. You can just unmute and ask me. I like to see people's faces anyways.
There was one more question that I missed. Will collective bargaining groups be able to bargain out of this?
It doesn't appear that there is. There was some sort of weird glitch that if you've got a union collective bargaining, that they wouldn't initially have to participate in it until it opened up again for collective bargaining. But most, because we've had such a gap in years and how long collective bargaining agreements are, I think most unions would be covered. And I'm not even I don't know why they had that weird loophole, because there really is no exemption or opt out if you cover long-term, you have other long-term care coverage in your collective bargaining agreement, but that one's still a little squirrely to me, Janessa. But look at your collective bargaining agreement. If it's already been reopened after that date I put, which is in 2017 forward, I can't remember the exact date. We'll have to look back. It's not fresh in my mind. Then they're covered too. It's a little bit, and also just because your company might also offer long-term care insurance does not let you opt your employees out of paying into the Washington Cares Fund. So I guess they get to double dip. They've got whatever's provided by the employer and whatever's provided by Washington Cares Fund.
Shannon just asked to be included on the information you send to Eric.
Shannon, I can't remember everything. Just email me, Shannon, and remind me of that. It's Karen@employersolutionslaw.com. All right. Well, I feel like the bearer of bad news. I don't think anyone seems super excited in this webinar about what's coming, but knowledge is power. I think being really thoughtful about what your workforce is, do they know about it? Giving them a heads up it's coming. I would give them a heads up of the limited exemptions. Go to Employment Security website. You can cut and paste, send them there. Just say, hey, employees, FYI, this is coming out of your paycheck starting July 1st. We have to do it, 0.58%, unless you meet an exemption, and Employment Security blesses that exemption and gives you a special letter that says we don't take the money out. We have to take it out. If you get us the letter after July 1st, we will stop taking money out in that following quarter, but you'll still have to pay into it for that quarter. But then you're basically exempt from the next quarter on. Now is the time to start communicating with your employees. So if they do qualify for one of the few remaining exemptions, they have time to get their paperwork in order and try to get that letter. And for everyone else, you're just managing expectations and tell them, don't shoot the messenger if you're unhappy about it. Some people think it's a great idea, right? Some people will be like, well, that's wonderful. I'm happy to pay into that for the social good. So if you think it's a great idea, you can sell why it is a great idea. If you think it's a horrible idea, then you can just say, this is what the government's telling us we have to do. Here's the materials from Employment Security, and kind of leave it at that. So you know your workforce, you know the culture of your business. You're in the best position to know how to communicate about this. But my advice is communicate early, communicate often. The biggest disruption happens when people are surprised. People don't like surprises, financial surprises. Well, with that, thank you so much for your kind attention. And I hope this was helpful and gave you good resources. Again, the Washington Cares website has resources for employers, more information. That's great, one-stop shopping. If you want more information or clarification, of course, you can follow up with our firm, but lawyers cost money. I'd say go for the free option of looking at what the government website has first. If something is squirrely or you get stuck, you're welcome to call us. All right, everybody, have a great rest of the day. Thank you.